Settle into the place where you are resting and let the room become a little quieter around you. Allow your shoulders to sink, your hands to become still, and your breathing to find its own slow and comfortable rhythm. There is nothing to solve tonight, and nothing in this long story that needs to be remembered in the morning. We will simply follow a small green leaf backward through time, while the steam above a cup rises, loosens, and disappears. I'm the Yawning Historian. Tonight, our journey begins beside an ordinary cup of tea. The cup may be plain, its glaze perhaps smooth beneath the fingers, and the water within it may hold only the faintest color. A few leaves rest near the bottom. They have softened after drying, packing, travel, and the brief return of hot water. Above them, a thread of steam turns in the air. It makes no sound. It carries an aroma that may be grassy, warm, woody, floral, or gently roasted, depending on the leaves and the hands that prepared them. The true tea plant is known today as Camellia sinensis. Many other plants can be soaked in hot water to make comforting infusions, from mint and chamomile to flowers and roots. But the leaves in this particular history came from the tea plant. Even that simple statement opens into a landscape rather than a single point on a map. The precise botanical origin of cultivated tea remains uncertain. Related populations and varieties have long been associated with broad regions reaching across southwestern China and neighboring lands. One important variety is probably native to western Yunnan, while another has connections across a wider warm region extending from Assam through parts of Southeast Asia and southern China. Modern borders provide tidy lines for atlases, but plants are older than those lines, and their ranges followed rain, elevation, soil, forest, seed, and human movement. Before there were written treatises about tea, people living among these plants could notice their bitterness, fragrance, texture, and usefulness. Leaves might be gathered, eaten, cooked, infused, or associated with remedies and ritual in different times and places. The surviving evidence does not allow one neat beginning to cover every community. Later traditions often associated early tea with medicine, yet that association should not be turned into a single moment of discovery. Knowledge could accumulate slowly, through repeated handling and observation, without leaving a date in a court record or a name on a vessel. A famous legend gives the beginning a much cleaner shape. It tells of the ancient figure Shinong and a leaf falling into heated water, sometimes assigning the event to the exact year 2737 before the Common Era. It is a graceful story, easy to picture beside a fire, but it remains a legend. Archaeology has not uncovered that scene, and the date is not a verified archaeological milestone. The legend belongs to the cultural memory of tea, while the material record speaks in quieter fragments. A stain, a residue, a vessel, a trace of plant matter preserved where no storyteller expected it to last. One such fragment came from a tomb dating to the Warring States period. A laboratory study published in 2021 examined charred residue from a bowl and identified it as tea residue left after boiling or brewing. The researchers were studying what remained in the object, not watching the drink being prepared, so the finding is best held with the careful wording of the study itself. It offers evidence of tea prepared in a vessel far back in time, while leaving many details unknown. The hands that held the bowl are beyond our view. The temperature of the liquid, the taste, the time of day, and the reason for placing the bowl in the tomb have all disappeared. What remains is enough to suggest a practice, but not enough to recreate a complete evening. Another study, published in 2016, identified traces of tea in the burial complex of the Han Emperor Jingdi at Yangling, dating to roughly 21 centuries ago. This was very early material evidence, found among the many objects and provisions associated with an imperial tomb. The discovery tells us that tea could enter a world of careful storage, elite consumption, and preparation for the afterlife. It does not mean that tea belonged only to palaces, nor does it tell us how often ordinary people drank it. Archaeological preservation favors some places and loses others. A sealed burial may protect traces that a village kitchen, used every day and rebuilt many times, would never keep. The same 2016 research also identified tea at Gurgium in western Tibet, a finding we will meet again when the leaf travels above the clouds. For now, it is enough to notice how early the leaf was already moving. It had left growing regions and entered networks of exchange. It could be carried as a valued substance, perhaps packed to endure distance, cold, dry air, and repeated handling. Each trace is small, yet together they show that tea history was already more than a local tale. It was a history of plants and people, vessels and routes, preservation and taste. Written culture gradually gives the leaf a more audible presence. In poems, records, and later compilations, tea appears among meals, medicines, offerings, hospitality, and cultivated pleasures. Its meanings were not fixed. One household could value its taste, another its warming preparation, another the alert attention associated with drinking it, and another the courtesy of serving it to a guest. Across long centuries in China, tea entered homes, places of work, social gatherings, ceremonial occasions, and spaces devoted to conversation. These practices changed from region to region and from one period to another. No single bowl could stand for them all. Silence remains around much of this early life. Records favor unusual gifts, prominent people, and objects preserved by wealth or burial. The tea made between routine tasks often left no durable sentence behind. We can acknowledge that missing space without filling it with invented scenes. The empty places in the archive are part of the slow history too. By the Tang dynasty, from the 7th through the early 10th centuries, tea had become a more widely popular drink. Growing, processing, trade, and connoisseurship formed a richer and more visible culture around it. Tea crossed social settings, though access and quality varied. It could be offered to a visitor, carried by travelers, exchanged as a product, discussed by officials and writers, and prepared by people whose names were never recorded. The expanding culture of tea depended on many ordinary acts: plucking leaves, controlling heat, shaping cakes, wrapping bundles, moving loads, fetching water, washing bowls, and tending charcoal. Before any cake reached a storeroom, the plant had to be known through the seasons. New growth appeared at the tips, tender beside older, firmer leaves. The precise choices varied across growing places and periods, and the surviving descriptions cannot recover every local method. Still, the leaf in the bowl began on a living plant, under changing light, where rain and warmth arrived on their own schedules. Gathering was followed by work that changed the fresh leaf into something more stable. Moisture had to be managed. Heat, pressure, drying, and shaping could be applied in combinations suited to the desired product. Tang cake tea was not simply a handful of leaves squeezed into a block. It belonged to a chain of practiced actions, each carrying the possibility of success, unevenness, or loss. Too much damp could threaten storage. Poor handling could flatten aroma. Good work required attention long before the drinker praised the water or bowl. The processing place had its own sensory world. Fresh leaves gave way to warmer, deeper aromas. Baskets rested against walls. Wood, cloth, trays, molds, and heating surfaces gathered stains from repeated use. Workers shifted material from one stage to another, judging it by sight and touch. Their knowledge was physical, It lived in the pressure of a hand, the appearance of a leaf, and the recognition that one batch needed more time while another was ready to move. Once shaped and dried, cakes could be wrapped for storage or travel. A storekeeper counted what arrived and watched for damp, insects, breakage, and theft. A merchant considered weight, quality, destination, and price. A porter considered the load against the body. A buyer at the far end might see only the finished form, but the compact cake contained a sequence of decisions made by people separated across distance. Popularity during the Tang also meant variation in quality and access. A rare product selected for a court or important gift belonged to a different economic world from tea prepared for routine use. The word tea joined them, but it did not make their circumstances equal. Written praise tends to preserve exceptional objects and refined opinions. Everyday bowls leave less language behind. Their absence from elegant texts does not make them less real. In the late 8th century, the writer Lu Yu compiled the classic of tea, an early and highly influential work devoted to the subject. He did not invent tea. The leaf, the drink, and generations of knowledge preceded him. His importance came from gathering and arranging a world that already existed, describing origins, cultivation, tools, preparation, water, utensils, and the experience of drinking. A scattered practice could now be contemplated through an organized text. Readers encountered tea not merely as something in a cup, but as a chain of choices extending from the hillside to the brazier. Imagine a Tang preparation room without making it grander than it needs to be. A low brazier sits on a firm floor. Charcoal glows beneath a vessel of water. Nearby lies a cake of processed tea, compact enough to store and carry. A mortar and a grinding tool wait beside a bowl. There may be a scoop, a cloth, a container, tongs, and a fan for managing the fire. The objects are practical, worn by use, and placed within easy reach. Their surfaces answer the hand differently. Cool ceramic, dry wood, rough charcoal, smooth metal, pressed leaf. Tea in the Tang period was often formed into cakes. The exact methods and recipes could vary, and practice did not remain unchanged across the whole dynasty or every region. A portion might be warmed or roasted, then broken and ground. The powder could be boiled or otherwise prepared with hot water, producing a drink unlike the loose leaf infusion that many listeners know today. Flavor depended on the plant and processing, but also on water, fire, timing, vessel, and the judgment of the person working beside the brazier. The cake made practical sense in a world of storage and movement. Loose leaves occupy space and can be fragile. Pressed tea is compact, easier to stack, wrap, and count. Yet compactness also changes preparation. The drinker must separate a portion and reduce it before it meets water. The making of a bowl begins with a little resistance. A hard edge gives way. Pieces fall into the mortar. The steady motion of grinding turns a transported object back into something fine enough to release its color and aroma. There is no hurry in this work. The powder becomes more even under repeated pressure. The person grinding can hear a low scrape and feel the change through the handle. Coarser fragments gradually disappear. Dust settles around the center of the mortar. The process is neither spectacle nor mystery. It is a domestic craft, made reliable through attention and repetition. Water receives equal attention. Lu Yu wrote about its selection and about the tools surrounding tea, reflecting a belief that the leaf could not be separated from the medium that carried its taste. Water drawn from different places would behave differently. Freshness, mineral character, and handling mattered, though historical preferences should not be turned into an unchanging rule for every drinker. A bucket, jar, or ladle carried the water into the preparation space. Before any fragrance rose from the tea, someone had already walked, lifted, poured, and waited. Fire added another rhythm. Charcoal had to be arranged and encouraged, but not allowed to rage. A fan moved air through the coals. The glow brightened, then softened. Heat traveled into the vessel. Small changes appeared in the water before a full boil. A tremor at the base, a gathering of bubbles, a faint movement along the surface. Historical descriptions could turn these stages into refined language, yet beneath the language remained the old household knowledge of watching and listening. The bowl mattered as well. Liu Yu discussed ceramic wares and their qualities, placing color, shape, and material within the appreciation of tea. A glaze could alter the way the liquor appeared. A rim met the mouth. The curve of a bowl held warmth against the palms. Potters, kiln workers, clay diggers, woodcutters, packers, and merchants stood far behind the quiet moment of drinking, even when their names never entered the written celebration of the cup. To follow a single bowl through its making would take us away from the leaf and into another patient history. Clay was gathered and prepared. The vessel was shaped, dried, glazed, stacked, fired, sorted, and moved. Some bowls survived. Others cracked in the kiln or broke on the road. The surviving pieces in museums can appear perfectly still, but they were born from heat and labor. They belonged in hands, beside food, under lamplight, among the small accidents of ordinary use. When tea powder met hot water, the earlier stages came together. The leaf carried the conditions of its hillside and the choices made during processing. The cake carried the pressure of shaping and the dryness of storage. The powder carried the rhythm of the mortar. The water carried its source. The bowl carried the work of the kiln. Fire joined them for a short interval, and a person decided when the preparation was ready. Taste in the Tang world was not one uniform taste. Tea could differ by district, season, handling, age, and grade. Methods could be adjusted, and additions appeared in some historical practices, though connoisseurs might praise greater restraint. Rather than choosing one recipe as the authentic cup of an entire dynasty, it is calmer and more accurate to imagine a broad field of habits. In one place, the drink may have been robust and practical. In another, it may have been discussed with exacting care. In both, the bowl cooled at the same unhurried pace. Tea also created occasions for company. Serving a drink gave structure to arrival, pause, and conversation. A host could prepare while guests settled. A traveler could receive warmth after a road. Colleagues could share time away from their tasks. Monastic, courtly, mercantile, and domestic settings each shaped the gesture differently. The simple movement of extending a bowl could carry welcome, rank, familiarity, obligation, or respect, depending on the people and the room. At the same time, tea was a traded product, and trade is made from more than elegant cups. Growers watched weather and leaf. Processors controlled heat and moisture. Porters carried loads along paths. Boat crews moved goods on rivers. Shopkeepers measured and stored portions. Officials could regulate, tax, present, or requisition valuable tea. A widening appetite drew more people into the work. The drink at one end of the chain was light in the hand, while the labor behind it was distributed across many landscapes. The Tang dynasty did not provide the final form of tea because tea never settled into one final form. Methods changed. Preferences shifted. New utensils acquired meaning. Powder, cakes, loose leaves, bowls, kettles, jars, and pots each moved forward or receded in different settings. Later people looked back to earlier practices while making something suited to their own rooms. Continuity and change sat together, like two tones within the same glaze. Liu Yu's ordered account helped later readers imagine that entire chain with unusual clarity. A tool that might seem humble could receive a place because preparation depended upon it. A container preserved what another tool measured. A brazier supported the fire that changed the water. A bowl completed the work but did not stand alone. The text gave dignity to sequence, showing that a good drink emerged from many small acts performed with care. Yet even an influential book could not freeze practice. Readers adapted its judgments to their own surroundings, and many people prepared tea without consulting a written authority at all. Local water, available fuel, household vessels, inherited habits, and practical necessity continued to matter. The written classic and the unwritten kitchen existed beside one another. Between them, tea became both an object of study and an ordinary companion. After the Tang, powdered tea would find especially refined expression in the Song dynasty. Finely prepared powder, pale foam, and dark glazed bowls would create a striking visual relationship. From China, objects and practices would also travel in long exchanges with Japan, entering monasteries, courts, merchant houses, and eventually the small tea rooms associated with chanoyu. Yet none of that needs to arrive quickly. For the moment, we can remain beside the earlier brazier. The room grows quieter as the preparation ends. A few grains of tea settle toward the bottom of the bowl, while the hand holding the fan slows beside the coals. The brazier gives one last amber glow, and the steam thins into the dark, leaving the leaf, the water, and the waiting clay at rest. In the centuries after the Tang, the bowl of tea remained a place where leaf, water, skill, and attention could meet. During the Song dynasty, powdered tea became the center of a particularly refined way of preparation. Leaves were processed, ground finely, and combined with hot water. The pale surface of the drink could be stirred or whisked into foam, and the color of that foam became more visible against bowls with dark glazes. A small vessel could hold a landscape of contrasts. Light tea against black or deep brown ceramic, a soft froth above a hard-fired surface, and rising steam against the stillness of the room. Grinding demanded patience before the water was poured. Fine powder did not appear in a single motion. It came from repetition, pressure, and the gradual reduction of dry tea into smaller particles. The powder could cling lightly to a scoop or gather in the curve of a bowl. Once hot water arrived, the preparer worked the surface, bringing liquid and leaf together. The sounds were modest: stone against tea, water entering ceramic, a tool moving through the bowl, and charcoal settling beneath a kettle. Dark glazed bowls were valued in part because they made the pale tea stand out. Kilns produced surfaces with subtle variations, streaks, mottling, and depth. No two fired objects needed to look exactly alike. Heat transformed minerals in the glaze, and the kiln preserved the result. When a drinker leaned close, the bowl framed the foam, while the rim and curve guided hand and mouth. The vessel was not a neutral container. It shaped sight, touch, temperature, and the pace of drinking. The Song world of powdered tea did not remain the only way to prepare the leaf. Under the Ming dynasty, steeping dried loose leaves in hot water within a pot became increasingly popular in many settings. This method is closer to a familiar modern infusion. Instead of reducing a cake or prepared leaf to fine powder for each bowl, the maker could place dried leaves into a vessel and allow the water to draw out color and aroma. Leaves opened slowly. Some floated before settling. The liquor could be poured into smaller cups, leaving much of the plant material behind. The change did not happen everywhere at once, and powdered tea did not simply vanish from every table. Historical practice is rarely so tidy. Methods overlapped, preferences differed, and objects continued to travel after fashions changed. Still, the broad movement from Song powdered preparation toward Ming loose leaf steeping altered the equipment and gestures surrounding tea. Pots became more prominent. The relationship between leaf size, vessel, water, and time took on a new form. The quiet act of waiting became part of preparation as dry leaves loosened beneath a lid. While techniques changed within China, tea was also moving through long exchanges with Japan. These exchanges did not occur in one journey or through one person. Monks, envoys, merchants, texts, ceramics, seeds, utensils, and habits crossed the sea at different times. Tea was present in courtly and monastic circles in Japan during the early medieval centuries, before it spread more broadly. Religious institutions formed part of its history, but they did not contain the whole story. Tea entered political, artistic, social, and commercial life as well. It is tempting to picture culture moving as a complete package from one shore to another, but the process was slower and more selective. An imported object might be used differently in its new home. A preparation method could be studied, adapted, forgotten, and revived. A word could acquire new shades of meaning. A ceramic vessel made for one purpose could later become precious for another. People in Japan did not merely reproduce a fixed Chinese model. They received objects and practices, valued them through local relationships, and gradually shaped new forms of gathering. One tea jar gives this process a particularly quiet and tangible shape. The jar later known as chigusa was made in China during the Song or Yuan period. It crossed the sea and, in Japan, entered a world of naming, wrapping, display, and written appreciation. The name transformed it from an anonymous storage vessel into an object with a social identity. Fine textiles were used around it. Tea records described how people encountered and admired it. The jar gathered a history beyond the intentions of its original makers. Chigusa was not valued only for perfect symmetry or flawless decoration. Its surface, shape, firing marks, and presence could reward careful looking. A guest might study the shoulders of the jar, the fall of its glaze, the marks left by kiln and handling, and the relationship between the ceramic body and the textile surrounding it. Time added another layer. The jar had traveled, survived, been held, named, dressed, and remembered. Its importance rested not in one isolated feature, but in the web of attention built around it. Tea diaries from the 16th century recorded details of gatherings and objects, showing how a vessel could become part of shared knowledge. Participants recognized names and lineages of ownership. They noted arrangements and responses. Such records do not preserve every voice in the room, and they often reflect people with access to elite cultural networks. Even so, they reveal how carefully tea objects could be placed within relationships among host, guest, memory, and status. By the 16th century, the practice known as chanoyu was taking a form recognizable in later Japanese tea culture. It was a secular, ritualized social art shaped by many influences, including religious and philosophical traditions. But it was not simply a religious rite. The preparation of tea gave structure to an encounter. The room, garden path, utensils, gestures, season, and chosen guests all mattered. A bowl of tea sat at the center, yet the gathering extended far beyond the drink itself. A traditional tea room could be very small, often holding only 4 or 5 people. Smallness changed behavior. Grand distance became difficult. Host and guest shared the same limited air, light, and floor. Each movement was visible. The sound of water or bamboo could fill the space without being loud. A low entrance in some rooms encouraged a change in posture before one entered. The architecture reduced the world to a few materials: plaster, wood, paper, tatami, clay, iron, bamboo, cloth, charcoal, and steam. The approach to such a room could begin before the doorway. A garden path separated the gathering from the pace outside, not by erasing the wider world, but by giving the body a few moments to adjust. Stone beneath the feet, leaves beside the path, a basin, a waiting place, and the subdued wall of the tea room could narrow attention. Weather remained present. Rain darkened stone. Summer air rested against paper screens. In colder months, the promise of charcoal became more noticeable. This approach did not require a large garden or extravagant display. Restraint could make a small change in texture feel important. The transition from street or residence to waiting area, then from waiting to the tea space, ordered the guest's arrival. By the time everyone sat, the gathering had already begun through walking, pausing, and noticing. Before the gathering, the host selected utensils for that particular occasion. The choice could respond to season, guest, theme, or the relationships among objects. A hanging scroll, flower container, kettle, tea jar, scoop, whisk, and bowl did not need to match in the modern sense. Their differences could create balance. An old Chinese ceramic might appear beside a modest Japanese or Korean vessel. A finely worked textile might wrap a jar whose surface bore the irregular record of firing. The host's work began well before the guests arrived. The room was cleaned. Water was prepared. Charcoal was arranged. Objects were placed, then perhaps reconsidered. The garden path and waiting area helped slow the approach. None of this required theatrical speed. The point was not to surprise the guest with a sudden effect. The gathering developed through ordered attention, with each object appearing at its proper time. Guests also had a role. They observed, received, handled, and responded. A bowl could be turned before drinking. Its front might be considered. After the tea was finished, the ceramic could be examined at close range. The guest noticed weight, texture, rim, foot, glaze, and signs of use. Courtesy took physical form in posture and sequence. Host and guest made the occasion together, even though their responsibilities differed. Conversation could occur, but the objects and actions gave it boundaries. Attention returned to the scroll, flowers, fire, utensils, and tea. A knowledgeable guest might recognize a maker, style, or inherited name. Another might simply receive the warmth and follow the host's guidance. The practice held room for learning because forms were transmitted through demonstration and repetition. A gesture watched many times gradually became familiar in the body. The temporary arrangement also protected the gathering from becoming a permanent display. When the guests left, the bowl would be washed, the utensils put away, the flour removed, and the room prepared for another use. The beauty of the event did not depend on keeping every object frozen in place. Its form existed for a limited time, shaped for those people and that season, then dissolved through ordinary cleaning. The aesthetic often associated with wabi became influential within this history. It gave value to restraint, modest materials, and surfaces that did not depend on polished luxury. Yet wabi should not be reduced to a simple slogan about imperfection, nor stretched to explain all Japanese culture. Within chanoyu, it helped create room for rustic ceramics from Japan and Korea beside treasured Chinese antiques. A roughly shaped bowl could acquire dignity through touch, context, and attentive use. Sun no Rikyu, who lived from 1522 to 1591, became one of the most influential figures in shaping chanoyu. He was not its lone inventor. Tea gathering had a long history before him, and other masters, patrons, craftsmen, merchants, monks, warriors, and hosts contributed to its forms. Rikyu's importance rested in the strength of his influence, his relationships with powerful patrons, and the lasting traditions associated with his approach to space, objects, and restrained practice. The familiar image of a peaceful tea room can conceal the political world around it. In the 16th century, leaders including Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi used chanoyu deliberately within networks of authority. Tea objects could be rewards, marks of favor, signs of access, and instruments of relationship. Gatherings could display taste and power even when the room itself looked humble. A prized utensil might carry political weight far beyond its small size. Hideyoshi could sponsor magnificent expressions of tea culture, while the quieter wabi room offered a different visual language. These modes could exist within the same broad practice. Simplicity did not automatically remove hierarchy, and luxury did not erase disciplined ritual. Chanoyu could hold apparent opposites together: modest clay and valuable lineage, intimate space and public authority, silence and social negotiation. After Rikyu's lifetime, tea practice continued to spread and change among samurai, aristocrats, clergy, wealthy townspeople, and other groups. Schools developed and transmitted patterns of preparation. Families, teachers, and students preserved forms while adjusting to new circumstances. No one line represented every gathering. Some occasions emphasized inherited discipline, some connoisseurship, some hospitality, some social connection, and many contained several of these at once. Transmission required ordinary repetition. Water was measured again, cloth folded again, and a bowl placed before another guest. Through such recurrence, formal knowledge became embodied memory. Small differences between teachers and lineages could be maintained without breaking the shared recognition of chanoyu as a gathered practice centered on tea, utensils, host, and guest. Craft traditions grew around the practice. Potters responded to the needs and tastes of tea communities. Bamboo workers shaped scoops and whisks. Metal workers made kettles. Lacquerers prepared containers. Textile makers produced bags and wrappings. Carpenters and plasterers built rooms of deliberate proportion. Gardeners shaped the path of approach. The finished bowl of tea depended on a circle of labor much larger than the few people seated on the floor. Each craft carried its own material patience. Bamboo had to be selected, cut, dried, split, shaved, and finished. Clay had to be prepared before the potter could shape it, and the kiln could still produce effects beyond complete control. Iron kettles required heat and force of another kind. Textiles brought fiber, dye, weaving, trade, and careful sewing into the tea room. The apparent simplicity of a gathering rested on many skilled hands. Repair could become part of an object's continuing life. A cherished vessel did not necessarily lose all value when age or use marked it. The degree and manner of repair mattered, as did the history attached to the object. Within tea culture, signs of survival could deepen attention, though this response should not be turned into a rule that every flaw was admired. Judgment remained specific. People considered the vessel before them, its lineage, handling, and fitness for the occasion. Storage was equally important. Objects waited between gatherings in boxes, cloth bags, cupboards, and storerooms. Labels, records, and oral knowledge helped preserve identity. The name jar chigusa gathered layers of wrapping and documentation because people continued to care for its presence. Preservation was not passive. Someone folded the cloth, closed the box, carried the jar, and decided when it should be seen again. Tea knowledge therefore moved through more than written instruction. It passed through families, workshops, schools, merchant networks, and repeated gatherings. A student watched the angle of a scoop or the arrangement of charcoal. A craftsperson learned the feel of bamboo or clay. A host learned how one bowl changed beside another. Culture continued because these small acts were performed again, not because they remained untouched. The bamboo whisk is among the lightest objects in that circle. It begins as a piece of bamboo, split and worked into many fine tines. In the hand, it can move quickly while producing a sound softer than metal. It draws powdered tea and water together, continuing a preparation whose distant history reaches back through exchanges with China and the powdered tea culture of the song. Yet in the Kyoto room, the whisk belongs to a new arrangement of space, etiquette, and meaning. Charcoal gives the gathering its slower pulse. It is set to heat the kettle efficiently and attractively. The host may attend to the sound of the water, sometimes described through images from nature, though each actual kettle speaks in its own small way. Heat rises through iron. Steam gathers near the lid. The room changes as the fire settles, and time is measured by preparation rather than by a visible clock. The tea itself may be bright against the bowl. A dark vessel can recall Ming practices brought pots and infused leaves into wider prominence, while powdered tea retained an enduring place within Japanese chanoyu. History did not choose one method and discard the other. The leaf could open under a lid or disperse beneath a whisk. Each method organized hands, vessels, and weighting differently. The teapot itself changed the geometry of serving. A bowl could be prepared and received as an individual center, while a pot gathered the infusion before distributing it among cups. Leaves expanded out of sight beneath a lid, and the pour revealed their work in color and aroma. The vessel's clay, size, spout, and handle affected use. Like the powdered bowl, it gathered craft and habit into a form small enough to hold in two hands. Across the sea, pots, jars, bowls, and texts continued to travel in both material and remembered form. Not every traveler understood an object in the same way as its maker. That difference was part of the history. Meaning accumulated through new rooms, new owners, and new combinations. The route from Song Bowl to Kyoto Tea Room was therefore not a straight transfer, but a long conversation carried in clay, leaf, bamboo, and practice. There is comfort in allowing both forms to remain beside one another. In one room, dry leaves unfurl slowly in clear water. In another, fine powder clouds the bowl and becomes an even green suspension. One asks for stillness during infusion. The other asks for a brief, controlled motion of bamboo. Both end with warmth held between the palms. The Kyoto room grows quiet after the final bowl. The whisk rests, its fine tines damp and still, while the charcoal beneath the kettle dims to a soft red. A guest lowers their gaze to the uneven line of glaze, and the small room holds only warm ceramic, faint steam, and an unhurried silence. A brick of tea does not look much like the tender leaf from which it began. It is firm, dark, and compact, with fragments of leaf pressed into a shape that can be lifted in one hand. Beside it lie a length of cord, a folded cloth, and a metal kettle marked by use. The brick is easier to stack than a mound of loose leaves, and less delicate on a long journey. Its history belongs to pressure, distance, elevation, weather, and the patient work of turning a plant into something that can travel above the clouds. Western Tibet holds one of the early material traces of that travel. A scientific study published in 2016 identified tea remains in a tomb at Gurgium, dated to around the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. The researchers interpreted the finding as evidence that tea had reached this high western region by about the year 200. They further argued that it pointed toward a branch of exchange across the Tibetan plateau. The study gives us a careful archaeological inference, not a complete itinerary. It does not provide the name of a carrier, the number of stops, or a map of every path. The small sample should not be stretched into the later idea of the tea horse road beginning at that exact moment. It shows that tea traveled early. The better-known networks linking tea-producing regions with Tibet developed across later centuries and changed repeatedly. They were not one paved highway with a fixed beginning and end. They were families of roads and paths, market connections, river crossings, passes, villages, administrative systems, and seasonal decisions. Some routes led from Yunnan, others from Sichuan, and each broad direction divided into smaller choices. A traveler might follow a valley while the water remained low, then climb when weather allowed. A bridge could wash away. Snow could close a pass. A local market could draw goods away from the route shown on an official map. Pack animals needed forage and rest. Porters needed food, shelter, and time. The network lived through these practical limits. To imagine it as a single road is to lose the texture of movement. There were departures delayed by rain, loads repacked after a strap broke, animals led around mud, and goods handed from one trader to another. Tea could change ownership more than once before reaching a highland household. Taxes, regulations, political conditions, and demand varied across place and period. Horses mattered within parts of this history, including systems of exchange connected with states, but tea was not always traded directly for a war horse, and the roads carried many goods besides these two. Far to the southeast of Gurgium, the old tea forests of Jingmai form another patient part of the story. The landscape was developed by Belang and Dai communities through a system of tea cultivation beneath forest cover. UNESCO describes practices there beginning in the 10th century and continuing for more than a millennium. Tea trees grew within a layered environment rather than across a bare, uniform field. Forest, village, knowledge, belief, and cultivation were held together through long local stewardship. The villages within this landscape were not merely stations beside valuable trees. Community life and cultivation shaped one another. Paths connected homes with forest plots. Knowledge of particular plants, slopes, shade, and seasonal conditions could pass through generations. The heritage recognized today rests on this continuing relationship between people and a managed forest ecology, not on an idea of untouched wilderness and not on a plantation imposed upon empty land. When pluckers moved beneath the canopy, the forest did not disappear behind the crop. Other trees remained overhead and around the tea. The arrangement helped preserve a complex landscape in which cultivation worked through the forest structure. Leaves entered baskets in small amounts, then gathered into larger batches. From there, human judgment guided processing, and the rooted life of the forest began its transformation into a portable product. Under a forest canopy, light arrives in broken patterns. Leaves above soften the sun. Moisture gathers in shade. Tea plants share the landscape with other vegetation, and the cultivated forest reflects decisions made over generations. People learned where tea grew well, how to manage the trees, when to pluck, and how to maintain relationships between settlement and woodland. This knowledge was not an empty background to trade. It made trade possible. Leaves from such landscapes entered processing, storage, and distribution networks. Pu'er became an important center for collecting and moving tea from the Song through the Qing periods. Routes associated with what is now called the ancient Tea Horse Road connected the region to markets and highland destinations. The phrase is useful when it reminds us of exchange across difficult terrain. It becomes misleading when it turns many changing networks into one unbroken line. Compression helped tea endure handling and occupy less space. Leaves could be pressed into cakes, bricks, or other forms, depending on place and method. A compact shape could be wrapped, tied, stacked, counted, and loaded. It could rest against another brick without scattering into the bottom of a basket. On a narrow mountain trail, order within the load mattered. Weight needed to be balanced. A package that held together reduced one small uncertainty among many. The work of compression began before the road. Leaves were gathered and processed, then softened or otherwise prepared for shaping according to the practices of the producer. Pressure brought the material together. A mold could give the tea a regular outline. Drying helped the form hold. The finished cake or brick bore signs of its making, sometimes with a surface pattern, an impression, or the uneven edges of leaf. Compact tea also invited division. A household or trader could break off a portion, though the brick resisted before it yielded. A knife or sturdy tool might be used with care. Fragments could be weighed, measured by experience, or prepared according to local habit. The form delayed the return of the individual leaf. First came the scrape, split, or crumble. Then water and heat softened what pressure had made firm. One preserved tea brick in the Smithsonian collection is classified as a form of alternative currency and associated with Tibet and Mongolia. It provides a bounded example of compressed tea serving not only as a drink, but also as a recognizable object of value. The example does not mean that every brick was money or that tea replaced coin across every market. Uses depended on period, region, quality, condition, trust, and circumstance. A brick could be merchandise, provision, gift, payment, or an object whose value shifted as it moved. Kept in a museum, that particular brick now serves as evidence for one documented use, while its careful classification reminds us to keep the example narrow. Commodity money works through recognition. People must understand the object well enough to judge it. A damaged brick, a poor mixture, or a shape of uncertain quality might not carry the same value as a trusted form. Tea also had the unusual quality of being consumable. It could circulate for a time, then be broken and prepared. Value ended not in an abstract ledger, but sometimes in a kettle. The road itself altered the meaning of the brick. Near a producing region, it represented processed leaf and the labor already invested in it. At a market, it became one item among wool, salt, cloth, metal goods, animals, grain, medicinal materials, and household necessities. On a pack saddle, it became weight that had to be balanced against other weight. At a highland destination, it could become warmth, nourishment, hospitality, and familiar taste. Elevation shaped every stage of the journey. Air cooled as paths climbed. Vegetation changed. The body noticed the slope, and animals placed their feet carefully on stone. Wind moved without asking permission from merchant or official. A clear morning could close into cloud. A valley visible at sunrise could be hidden by midday. Routes were remembered through landmarks, settlements, water, experience, and the advice of people who knew the terrain. Caravans should not be imagined only as grand processions. Many movements were smaller. A few animals and several people could carry goods between nearby points. Loads could be relayed through a sequence of communities. Some travelers covered long distances, while others knew one segment intimately. The network depended on both. The person who crossed a famous pass and the person who maintained a local link each belonged to the same extended movement. Pack animals varied with terrain and region. Their harnesses needed checking. Loads shifted as paths tilted. Bells, hoofbeats, breathing, spoken guidance, and wind formed the sound of travel. At a stopping place, cords were loosened and bundles examined. Damp wrapping might be dried. A cracked container might be repaired. Tea waited inside its compact form, carrying the scent of leaf beneath cloth, hide, basket, or rope. Markets gathered these routes for a while. Goods arrived from different directions and stood close together. Tea could be inspected, negotiated over, divided, repacked, or sent onward. News traveled with it. So did styles, words, stories, and practical knowledge. The exchange network was never only about objects. People learned which pass was open, which district had produced a good harvest, which official demanded a fee, and which household offered shelter. A market day compressed distance in another way. Wool from a highland flock could lie near cloth moved from lower valleys. Salt, grain, metal, medicinal plants, and tea occupied neighboring spaces. Scales and measures helped transactions, but reputation also mattered. Traders returned to people they trusted. A familiar mark on a package or a known origin could shape judgment, while weather and shortage could shift value from one season to the next. After an exchange, the network opened again. Some goods stayed in the settlement. Others left by a new path under new ownership. A brick produced and wrapped by one community could be carried by several others, spending nights in storerooms and temporary shelters before reaching its destination. No participant needed to know the entire route. The chain worked because each segment joined another. State interest sometimes focused strongly on the relationship between tea and horses. Horses could matter for transport and military power, while tea was valued in highland markets. Regulations and exchange systems developed in particular periods. Yet the neat phrase tea for horses should not flatten the many intermediaries and goods surrounding these policies. A household cup at the end of the route did not arrive through one simple bargain. It came through overlapping forms of labor and authority. Within Tibetan traditions, tea could be prepared with salt and yak butter. Historical descriptions also mention brick tea being boiled and, in some contexts, combined with butter, salt, and sometimes tsampa. These details belong to particular records and practices rather than to one fixed recipe followed by every family. Tibetan tea life has varied across region, household, occasion, and time. Still, yak butter tea has been described as a staple, holding a place beyond that of a light refreshment. To prepare it, the hard tea first had to return to liquid. A portion was separated from the brick and boiled. The resulting tea could be strained or handled according to household practice. Salt and butter were incorporated, often through vigorous mixing in a churn. The motion brought together water, tea, fat, and salt, creating a drink with body and a sheen that caught the firelight. The churn gave the preparation a different rhythm from the fine bamboo whisk of a Kyoto tea room. It was taller, sturdier, and suited to mixing substantial ingredients. A plunger moved within it. The person preparing tea worked with repeated strokes until the liquid became even. The sound was low and regular. Outside, wind could move along the walls. Inside, the kettle, churn, cups, and fire made a small center of warmth. Fuel also belonged to this center. At elevation, every fire depended on material gathered, stored, or traded according to local conditions. A kettle did not heat itself, and the comfort of an interior rested on repeated practical labor. Someone protected the fuel from damp, lit it, watched the flame, and kept vessels near enough to warm. The history of tea above the clouds was therefore also a history of making heat, where wind and cold could quickly remove it. Water had its own route into the room. It might be carried from a nearby source, stored, then poured into a darkened kettle. The exact source and handling varied widely, yet the action remained basic and necessary. The pressed leaf had crossed an enormous distance, but its final transformation depended on local water and local fire. Trade supplied one ingredient. Household knowledge completed the drink. Yak butter connected the drink to highland pastoral life. It carried the labor of tending animals, milking, separating, storing, and transporting. Salt carried another chain of gathering and exchange. Tea brought distant forests and processing places into the room. One cup held several landscapes at once. Its ingredients had traveled differently, then met under the same roof. It is best not to assign the drink a simplified medical purpose. People do not need a modern nutritional slogan in order to value warmth, energy, taste, custom, and hospitality. A substantial tea could belong to the ordinary rhythm of a day. It could be offered to a guest, replenished as people talked, or taken while work paused. The cup was practical and social at the same time. Hospitality gave the traveling leaf another kind of passage. After crossing forests, markets, rivers, and passes, tea crossed the small distance from host to guest. The cup carried welcome through a gesture rather than a speech. Refilling could extend the visit. The warmth remained in the hands after the first sip. In a place where outside weather could be severe, the interior act of serving acquired its own steady importance. A visitor did not need to know every century behind the cup in order to understand the immediate kindness. The drink was present, warm, and shared. History sat within it without requiring explanation. The forest and the road had become ordinary enough to enter conversation, rest, work, and family life. This ordinariness may be the deepest sign that a traded leaf had found a home. At different times, preparation could happen in households, religious settings, stopping places, markets, and other social spaces. The meaning shifted with the setting. A cup offered during travel did not carry precisely the same expectations as tea prepared in a settled family room. Rather than searching for one representative Tibetan ceremony, it is more faithful to keep the scene plural, made from many communities and habits. The taste also resisted a single description. Tea strength, salt, butter, texture, and accompanying food could vary. Some cups were more substantial, some lighter. Ingredients available on a particular day shaped the result. Tradition provided patterns, while the person at the kettle made practical decisions. The drink remained recognizable without becoming identical. Objects around the drink were shaped by use. A kettle darkened over repeated fires. A churn became smooth where hands held it. Wooden bowls or other vessels collected marks. Cloth absorbed familiar scents. None of these objects needed to be luxurious to contain history. Repetition made them intimate. The same motions, performed over years, joined a household to routes and growing regions far away. Tea bricks could rest for long periods before preparation. Storage protected them from unnecessary damp and damage as well as circumstances allowed. Their aromas and qualities could change with material, processing, age, and environment. It would be misleading to give every compressed tea one identical character. Some were made for ordinary transport and use. Others became objects of trade or collection. The category contains many histories under one compact shape. The road network also changed over time. Political borders shifted. New transport technologies altered the cost and speed of movement. Markets grew or declined. Some old paths remained important locally even when larger trade patterns moved elsewhere. The name Tea Horse Road now gathers memory, heritage, and tourism, as well as historical exchange. Beneath that name lie the particular paths known by people who walked them. Those paths can be remembered without pretending that they remained unchanged. A stone step may outlast the market that once depended on it. A village may keep stories of carriers after traffic moves elsewhere. Landscape holds traces unevenly, just as archaeology does, preserving one wall, one object, or one worn passage while countless footsteps leave no visible mark. Jingmai's cultivated forests remind us that the journey began with rooted plants and community knowledge. Gurgium's archaeological trace reminds us that movement across the plateau was already occurring many centuries ago. The Smithsonian brick reminds us that a compressed food or drink could become a standardized object of value in some contexts. The butter tea cup reminds us that trade ends in daily life, where goods are transformed by local taste. If we return to the brick beside the kettle, it now appears less silent. Its pressed surface contains plucking and processing, forest shade, wrapping, bargaining, animal steps, human shoulders, cold passes, and sheltered rooms. Yet it still asks for the simplest elements before it can be shared. A portion must be loosened. Water must be heated. Someone must wait beside the fire. Outside, wind moves gently against the shelter while the kettle gives a low and steady sound. The surface of the butter tea holds a small amber reflection, and the hand stirring it slows. Beyond the doorway, cloud settles across the mountain paths until road, stone, and distance become one quiet shade. In London during the 1660s, tea could still look less like an ordinary drink than a small and guarded treasure. A household fortunate enough to possess a little might keep the dried leaves in a caddy fitted with a lock, then bring out a modest quantity when guests arrived and the porcelain cups were arranged. The leaves had traveled farther than nearly anything else on the table. They had crossed Chinese roads and waterways, passed through the hands of merchants and warehouse keepers, entered the damp holds of ships, and survived a long sea passage before reaching a room where rain pressed softly against the glass. The spoon was small, the serving careful, and the silence around the caddy carried the calm attention given to something rare. Tea did not arrive in Europe through a single doorway. Portuguese and Dutch merchants had already carried it into European trade early in the 17th century, along with porcelain, silk, spices, and many other goods gathered through Asian commercial networks. By the time tea appeared in England in the 1660s, it already had a history there as an imported curiosity rather than as an entirely unknown leaf. Coffee houses advertised it, merchants discussed it, and people with money enough to experiment tasted it in small amounts. The early English cup belonged to a much larger maritime world, one in which European ships entered trading systems that had been active long before those ships appeared. Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese princess who married Charles II in 1662, became closely associated with tea at the English court. She did not bring the drink to a country that had never seen it. Instead, her preference helped make it fashionable among courtiers who watched royal habits and reproduced them in their own rooms. A cup held near an embroidered sleeve could become a sign of refinement, access, and cosmopolitan taste. The ritual remained intimate, with hot water, precious leaves, thin porcelain, and conversation at a measured pace. Yet behind that quiet table stood docks, customs officers, company clerks, sailors, brokers, and distant producers whose work was absent from the polished surface of the cup. At this stage, tea was expensive enough to be measured with unusual care. Locked caddies were practical protections against theft by anyone in the household, including servants who lived among valuable goods but did not own them. The lock also announced value. Sugar could be kept in similarly guarded containers, while fine porcelain displayed both wealth and participation in overseas trade. A person opening the caddy might hear the dry leaves shift with a faint, papery sound, then count out a portion and close the lid again. What later became a familiar kitchen action was still performed as a small ceremony of possession. The East India Company gradually became central to the English tea trade. In its earlier dealings, the company obtained tea through intermediary markets, but by the beginning of the 18th century, it was importing directly from China. Between 1709 and 1765, archival records show tea coming to dominate more and more of the company's commercial activity. Ships sailed outward with silver and other goods, and returned with chests whose contents were sold through carefully managed systems. Warehouses filled with the dry scent of leaf and timber. Clerks copied quantities into ledgers. Auctioneers moved lots through crowded rooms, and the tea that had once been a courtly novelty began to find a wider, though still expensive, public. The company was not simply a merchant among equal merchants. It held privileges granted by the state, commanded ships and forts, influenced law, and eventually exercised political power across territories in South Asia. Tea entered Britain through this institutional structure, protected by monopoly and connected to imperial expansion. The cup on the table remained quiet, but its route was governed by charters, armed power, customs rules, and the ability of a company to shape markets far from the person who lifted the porcelain. To remember this does not make the cup louder. It merely allows the room to include the people and systems that polite habit tended to hide. As demand grew, taxation made tea an unusually tempting object for smugglers. Duties could push the legal price far above what many households were willing or able to pay. Along the coasts of Britain, small vessels landed cargo in coves and inlets, while inland networks moved packets through barns, inns, market towns, and private houses. Smuggled tea could be mixed with other leaves or handled badly, yet it reached customers beyond the official warehouses. A respectable cup might therefore begin with an illegal landing on a dark shore, followed by a quiet cart journey before dawn. The ordinary desire for warmth and flavor had become entangled with a fiscal system that made avoidance profitable. The work of smuggling was less romantic than the neat silhouettes later stories gave to boats under the moon. It involved uncertainty, corruption, coercion, and the constant calculation of risk. Customs officers searched roads and buildings, while communities that depended on contraband might protect the routes that served them. Tea was light enough to divide, valuable enough to justify transport, and desired in enough kitchens to sustain the trade. The same leaves could pass through a company auction or through a hidden cellar, and by the time they entered the pot the difference might be invisible. In 1784, the Commutation Act sharply reduced the duty on tea from a rate recorded as 119% to 12.5%. The change did not make every hidden packet disappear, but it reduced the great advantage that smugglers had enjoyed. Legal tea became more affordable, official imports rose, and the government's lower rate could draw more transactions into the taxed market. In shops and storerooms, the balance slowly shifted from secrecy toward routine purchase. The locked caddy still remained in many homes, partly from habit and partly because tea retained value. But the key no longer guarded quite the same kind of treasure. The lower duty also changed the meaning of an ordinary receipt. Tea purchased through a legal shop no longer carried such a punishing addition from the customs system, so a wider circle of customers could enter the recorded market. A government that had once demanded an extreme rate found steadier trade through moderation. The kettle did not know the law had changed, but the household purse did. Affordability was built from more than taxation. The English taste for tea increasingly included sugar, especially from around the 1720s onward, and the histories of the two commodities moved together. Much of the sugar reaching British tables came from West Indian plantations worked by enslaved people. The sweetness that softened bitterness was created within a system of forced labor, dispossession, and profit. A spoon stirring pale crystals into tea joined an Asian commodity chained to an Atlantic one. The motion was gentle, but the relationship was not innocent. It is easy for familiar objects to make difficult histories seem distant. A sugar bowl has smooth sides, a teacup fits the hand, and a table laid in the morning suggests domestic peace. Yet the growing British habit depended on labor performed under radically unequal conditions. Chinese growers and processors prepared tea for foreign markets. Sailors carried it across oceans. Enslaved workers cultivated and processed cane under plantation rule. Dockers, carters, servants, shopkeepers, and street sellers brought the two products together in British homes. The cup gathered these lives without naming them. Sugar also changed how tea fitted into working days. A warm, sweetened drink provided flavor and calories, and it could be prepared with less equipment than a full meal. In households with limited fuel and crowded schedules, the kettle offered a repeatable pause. The drink moved from drawing room display toward breakfast tables, workshops, servants' rooms, and evening meals. This wider use did not erase distinctions of class. The quality of leaves, strength of the brew, amount of sugar, condition of the cup, and leisure available for drinking varied widely. Still, the gesture of pouring became recognizable across a larger part of society. Across the Atlantic, tea acquired another layer of political meaning. The Tea Act of 1773 did not simply impose a new tax upon an otherwise untouched drink. It adjusted the way the East India Company could sell tea to the colonies, giving the company advantages while the existing Townshend duty remained. For many colonists, the dispute involved taxation without representation, commercial privilege, and fear of accepting a precedent for parliamentary authority. Tea chests became visible symbols of a much broader conflict. In Boston in December 1773, protesters destroyed cargo rather than allow it to be landed under the contested arrangement. A company claim recorded the loss of 340 chests of tea. The number belonged to ledgers and compensation requests as much as to patriotic memory. Each chest had been packed, carried, insured, invoiced, and expected to produce revenue. When the tea entered the harbor, the act transformed commercial stock into political theater. The leaves darkened the cold water, while officials and merchants began the slow work of recording what had happened. The event, later known as the Boston Tea Party, became one of the most remembered scenes in the approach to the American Revolution. But the tea itself had already traveled through a world of privilege and extraction. The East India Company's special position mattered. The continuing duty mattered. Arguments over representation mattered. So did the company's financial difficulties and Parliament's attempt to manage them. The harbor scene was therefore not a simple quarrel over the price of a drink. It was a moment when a household commodity made imperial structures visible enough to resist. Back in Britain, tea consumption continued to rise, and the demand for Chinese tea produced a persistent problem for British merchants. China sold goods Europeans wanted, while British products did not find an equivalent market there. Silver flowed eastward to settle the difference. For the East India Company, this imbalance placed pressure on the system that supplied Britain's growing habit. The solution the company pursued connected tea to another trade, conducted through colonial control in India and smuggling into China. The company produced opium in Bengal and sold it through arrangements that supplied an illegal trade into China. The opium generated funds that helped recover the silver spent on tea. This was not an accidental side road beside the history of the British cup. It became part of the financial structure that sustained the exchange. The effects in China were profound and destructive, while the profits and fiscal advantages served imperial interests. The porcelain cup in London remained delicate, yet the balanced sheet beneath it had grown heavy. There is no need to sharpen this history into spectacle. Its scale can be understood through repetition. Season after season, tea chests moved west and silver moved east. Opium moved through another route, and payments turned back through company accounts. Officials issued restrictions, merchants sought ways around them, and communities lived with consequences that a British breakfast table did not reveal. The kettle boiled, the leaves opened, and the system continued because millions of small acts of consumption joined a much larger machinery of commerce and power. The language of taste often disguised this machinery. Advertisements discussed strength, fragrance, freshness, and price. Dealers offered names such as Bohi, Kongu, Sochong, Hyson, and Singlo, historical commercial categories that do not fit neatly into every modern label. Customers learned preferences and compared shops. A household might blame weak color on poor leaves or on a seller's dishonesty. Such concerns were real within daily life, while the political origins of supply remained easier to ignore. Empire entered the home as a matter of flavor. Tea were also changed with demand. British potters studied imported porcelain and developed new forms and materials for a growing market. Cups, pots, strainers, trays, spoons, sugar basins, and milk jugs created an entire domestic landscape around the drink. Some objects were costly and ornamental, while others were plain enough for routine use. The expanding material culture made tea feel local. A pot made in Britain and set on a British table could obscure the long path of the leaf, even though that leaf still came from China through commercial systems shaped abroad. The custom later associated with afternoon tea took a recognizable form during the 19th century, but it did not need a single inventor to exist. Meals, visiting practices, working hours, class habits, and fashions gradually created occasions for tea with bread, cakes, or small savory foods. In grand houses, service could be elaborate. In modest homes, a mug and something simple to eat were enough. The phrase gathered different practices into a pleasing image, yet the broader importance of tea lay in its adaptability to many rooms and many budgets. Retail made that adaptability visible one measured parcel at a time. A shopkeeper opened a chest, lifted out dry leaves, balanced weights against them, and folded the purchase into paper for the walk home. Customers could choose according to purse and preference, while merchants learned to promise strength, fragrance, and dependable color. The transaction placed an oceanic trade within reach of the street. Behind the counter, chests still carried the marks of distant packing and transport, but the customer left with a packet small enough to tuck beside bread or candles in a basket. The packet crossed one more small distance through lanes and doorways before its contents reached a shelf. There it waited beside salt, flour, jars, and whatever else the household could afford. A large imperial network had been reduced to a folded square of paper, light enough to carry in a coat pocket. When the fold was opened, the scent gave no account of customs disputes, company privileges, or Atlantic sugar. It offered the dry and concentrated promise of the next pot. Domestic preparation then gave imported tea a household rhythm. Someone had to fetch water, heap fuel, clean the pot, warm the cups, and carry the tray. Much of that work belonged to women and servants, even when portraits and advertisements centered the person being served. A refined tea table depended upon labor within the home just as surely as it depended upon labor overseas. The pause enjoyed by one person could be another person's task, performed quietly before a cup was poured and repeated after the last saucer had been cleared. In 1834, the East India Company's monopoly in the China trade ended. Competition, expanding supply, changes in taxation, and the development of colonial production contributed together to lower prices over time. By the middle of the 19th century, tea had become common across many levels of British society. It was served at breakfast, carried to work, poured during visits, offered to people in grief, and placed beside the fire at the close of day. A product once displayed by the court had become part of the language of ordinary hospitality. This wider access did not dissolve the unequal foundations of the trade. Instead, it made those foundations more extensive. More cups required more leaves, more shipping, more warehousing, more sugar, and more labor. Britain increasingly looked toward land under imperial control as a way to reduce dependence on Chinese tea. Botanical knowledge, local expertise, company ambition, and coercive systems would be drawn into new plantation landscapes in Assam and Ceylon. The familiar drink was preparing to change the countryside far from Britain. Within the British home, however, the story appeared smaller. Water was heated over coal or wood, then later on improved ranges. The pot was warmed, leaves were measured, and the brew stood for a few minutes beneath a lid. Milk or sugar might be added according to household custom and means. A servant could carry the tray upstairs, a worker could pour from a tin vessel, and a family could gather around a scratch table. Tea made a pause that was both social and practical. The pause could soften the edges of a day without erasing its conditions. Factory hours remained long. Servants still worked while others rested, and poverty did not disappear into steam. Yet people used the drink within the lives available to them. They shared news, counted coins, folded letters, and warmed their hands. A commodity shaped by imperial power could also become part of private care, which is one reason its history resists a single moral picture. The comfort was real, and so were the systems that delivered it. In a prosperous parlor, the tea caddy might sit beside a silver spoon and a polished pot. In a narrow kitchen, leaves might be steeped more than once. In a shop, a merchant weighed portions into paper. At the docks, chests were unloaded beneath gray skies. In China, growers and processors continued the skilled work that made the trade possible, even as foreign companies sought greater control over supply. One drink existed in many places at once, its quiet surface holding a map of unequal exchange. The British cup did not take over through taste alone. State privilege, maritime force, taxation, smuggling, plantation sugar, political protest, and the search for silver each shaped its passage. Fashion opened the door, commerce expanded the route, and affordability made repetition possible. By the 19th century, repetition had made tea seem timeless, as if it had long waited beside the British fire. In truth, the habit had been assembled piece by piece within a particular history. Now the rain beyond the window falls in fine, nearly invisible lines, and a spoon returns gently to its saucer. The caddy rests on the table with its little lid closed, no longer guarded by the anxious turn of a key. Steam thins above the cup, and the room grows quiet enough to hear the weather breathing against the glass. Far to the east of the London Rain, the valleys of Assam held a different kind of tea story. The air was warm and wet, broad rivers moved through low country, and forest plants grew with a density that made European garden descriptions seem thin. Tea with larger leaves belonged to this environment, and to a botanical range extending beyond any simple modern border. Local communities already knew the plant. Among the Singpho, knowledge of its leaves, preparation, and use existed before British commercial plans arrived, carried through practice rather than through the reports of a colonial committee. In accounts from the 1820s, Robert Bruce learned of tea growing in Assam through Muniram Dutta Barua and through Singpho knowledge. The careful verb is learned. A plant does not wait to exist until a visitor writes about it, and local knowledge does not begin when it enters a company archive. The meeting matters because it shows how imperial institutions often gathered information. Someone who knew the landscape pointed, explained, translated, or introduced. Another person carried that knowledge into a system with the money and political power to claim, classify, and expand it. The Assam variety of Camellia sinensis was suited to warm conditions across a wider region that included Assam and extended through parts of Southeast Asia and southern China. Its leaves and growth differed from the smaller-leaved variety associated with other tea districts. Botanists debated classification, collected specimens, and tried to determine whether the Assam plants could support commercial production. For the East India Company, the question was not botanical curiosity alone. Britain wanted tea in increasing quantities, while its dependence on Chinese supply required silver and placed the trade within rising political tension. The end of the company's monopoly over trade with China in 1834 changed its formal position, but it did not reduce the imperial desire for a controlled source of tea. That same year, the colonial government established a tea committee to examine cultivation in Assam. Reports traveled between officials, botanists, merchants, and administrators. Seeds and plants were compared. Test plots were cleared. Processing methods had to be understood, because a leaf on a shrub was not yet the dry, stable tea that could survive storage and travel. The committee's work sat upon local knowledge even when official language placed European investigators in the foreground. People in Assam knew where the plants grew and how leaves had been used. Guides moved through terrain that outsiders did not understand. Interpreters connected words and practices. Laborers cleared ground, carried material, tended nurseries, built structures, and watched experimental batches change under heat. The archive tends to preserve the names of officials more readily than the names of the many people whose work made their reports possible. Experimental plantations developed in the late 1830s, and the Assam Company formed in 1839 as commercial production expanded. Investors in Britain imagined regular cargoes that would loosen China's hold over supply. In Assam, this vision required land. Forest and cultivated spaces were surveyed through colonial categories, then transferred or leased under rules that favored plantation enterprise. Roads, drainage, nurseries, factories, and labor lines appeared where a different landscape had existed. A cup of tea was becoming a plan for reorganizing territory. The early process was uncertain. Plants failed in unsuitable ground. Seeds lost their vitality during travel. weather disrupted schedules. The character of Assam tea had to be learned through repeated handling, with attention to plucking, withering, rolling, oxidation, and drying. Chinese knowledge remained important, while local plants increasingly proved valuable in their own right. No solitary figure created the result. It emerged from indigenous knowledge, botanical collection, imported expertise, company capital, colonial authority, and the physical labor of people whose names were rarely placed on tea tins. British officials also looked toward China for plants and processing knowledge. In 1848, the East India Company employed Robert Fortune to travel into Chinese tea districts and secretly collect living plants, seeds, tools, and information about manufacture. He moved through places where foreigners faced restrictions, observing workshops and arranging shipments. Later retellings often made this sound like a neat adventure by a clever plant hunter. In its fuller setting, it was an act of industrial espionage conducted for an imperial company seeking to transfer a valuable crop and the knowledge surrounding it. Fortune used Wardian cases, glazed containers designed to protect living plants during long sea voyages. Inside each case, moisture could circulate in a partly closed environment, reducing the need for constant watering and shielding tender growth from salt air. The cases looked like small windows set over wooden bases. Leaves pressed toward the light while ships rolled beneath them. Some plants survived the journey, though survival did not make every introduction successful. Assam's own tea plants eventually mattered more to production there than the simple story of imported Chinese specimens suggests. A Wardian case preserved a plant, but it could not contain an entire craft. It carried roots, stems, soil, and humid air, while decisions about harvest and manufacture remained with people. This distinction helps keep the transfer in proportion. The glass case was an important transport tool, not a substitute for Assam plants, local land knowledge, Chinese processing skill, or the workers who turned experiment into sustained production. Knowledge traveled in less visible containers as well. Techniques for preparing green and black teas required trained observation, touch, timing, and heat. Chinese workers and specialists carried skills that could not be reduced to seeds in a box. Colonial managers tried to record these methods as transferable procedures. Yet cultivation and processing changed with leaf, weather, altitude, tools, and desired market. The result in India was not a perfect copy of a Chinese district. It became a set of new plantation systems built from multiple sources under unequal control. As the plantations expanded, the demand for labor grew. Assam was not an empty place waiting for a workforce. Colonial enterprise nevertheless described labor as scarce when local people would not enter plantation conditions in the numbers and at the wages planters wanted. From the middle of the 1860s, large numbers of migrant workers were recruited under indenture contracts, often from distant parts of India. Recruiters offered promises and advances, while the journey itself separated families and individuals from familiar communities and made return difficult. Indenture was presented in official language as a contract. In practice, colonial laws and plantation management created severe imbalances of power. Workers could find their movement restricted, their debts extended, and their ability to leave constrained. Employers sought to keep labor costs low and production regular. The state knew of abuses, yet legal and administrative systems continued to support coercive arrangements. The result combined economic pressure with physical control, even when plantation publicity preferred images of order, productivity, and benevolent supervision. It is possible to describe this clearly without turning suffering into spectacle. A worker rose at an hour set by the estate, walked to an assigned section, and completed tasks under rules he or she did not make. Pay, food, housing, health, family life, and permission to move were shaped by management. A contract written far from home could become a fence around daily choices. The tea bushes were green and the mist could be beautiful, while the labor system beneath that beauty remained coercive. Women became central to plucking, their work judged by both quantity and the selection of suitable shoots. Fingers moved repeatedly across the bushes, taking tender growth and placing it into baskets. The gesture required speed, recognition, and endurance. Men and women also cleared land, planted, weeded, pruned, carried loads, maintained roads, fired machinery, and worked inside factories. Plantation tea depended on coordinated labor across the entire estate. The image of a lone planter standing before orderly rows concealed nearly everything that made the rows productive. The factory translated fresh green leaf into a durable commodity. Baskets arrived and were weighed. Leaves spread across racks or troughs to lose moisture, then passed through rolling and oxidation according to the style being made. Heat stopped the transformation and reduced moisture further. Sorting divided the finished tea by size and appearance before packing. Each stage followed a timetable, but the timetable responded to the material. A hot day, a damp night, or a coarse batch could change what workers needed to do. The smell inside such a factory shifted through the process. Fresh leaf carried a green, living scent. Withering softened it. Rolling released juices and darkened surfaces. Oxidation brought warmer aromas, and drying filled the air with heat and the fragrance of finished tea. Machines increased volume, yet hands still fed, spread, checked, lifted, and packed. The product leaving the factory looked calm and dry, its tangled pieces giving little sign of the wet hills or repeated motions from which it came. Assam tea entered auctions, blends, and branded packets in Britain. Its strength suited changing tastes, and it became a major source for the expanding market. Advertisements could turn the plantation into a distant garden, fresh and orderly, while leaving out land control and indenture. Consumers saw labels, prices, and reassuring names. The labor line, recruiter, magistrate, and penal provisions remained beyond the edge of the image. Empire made distance into a commercial advantage, allowing a difficult landscape of work to arrive as a tidy package. Resistance existed within plantation life. Workers did not simply accept every condition in silence. Historical scholarship records forms of refusal, desertion, collective protest, negotiation, and everyday efforts to protect family and autonomy. These actions took place within strong constraints, and official records often describe them unsympathetically. Still, they remind us that laborers were not passive parts of a machine. They assessed circumstances, built communities, preserved practices, and sought room to act where the system attempted to narrow it. Plantation communities also made lives that exceeded the estate's accounting. Languages, songs, foodways, kinship, worship, childcare, and mutual assistance traveled with migrants and changed in new surroundings. A manager's ledger might reduce a household to a labor number, yet no household understood itself that way. People tended cooking fires after work, exchanged news, cared for illness, marked occasions, and taught children what they could preserve. These ordinary acts did not remove coercion, but they kept human identity wider than the contract that had brought workers to the garden. Skill accumulated through seasons. A plucker learned how rain changed the weight and feel of shoots, where a bush produced tender growth, and how to move without damaging what would form the next harvest. Factory workers learned the smell and suppleness of a properly withered leaf in the moment when heat had done enough. Such knowledge was practical, local, and often passed between workers without receiving the status granted to a planter's published report. The quality sold under an estate name depended upon this patient intelligence. Maintenance demanded another kind of patience. Bushes were pruned, paths repaired, drainage cleared, baskets mended, and factory surfaces prepared for the arrival of fresh leaf. None of these actions made a dramatic company report, yet neglected work would soon appear in a poor harvest or a damaged batch. The plantation's orderly appearance was renewed each day by people whose routines began before a buyer tasted the result and continued after the final basket had entered the factory. Tea cultivation also reshaped ecology. Clearing and planting altered forests, soils, drainage, and relations between people and land. Plantation rose a simplified space for efficient supervision and harvest. Shade trees, roads, factory sites, and housing created a managed environment directed toward export. The landscape could appear lush in photographs, but green color alone did not mean ecological continuity. A tea garden was an engineered field of production, not the same thing as the forest and local land use that had preceded it. Across the Bay of Bengal, another plantation economy was preparing to change. Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, had become deeply invested in coffee under British colonial rule. Hillsides were cleared and planted, roads connected estates to ports, and export earnings depended heavily on the crop. Then coffee rust appeared in 1869. The fungus-marked leaves with pale and reddish patches, weakening plants and reducing yields. Over little more than a decade, the coffee economy collapsed, leaving estates and investors searching for another profitable crop. Tea had already been tried on the island before the rust crisis. James Taylor, working at Lulakandara, experimented with tea processing in 1866 and developed a modest area of cultivation. He later sent a small shipment of 23 pounds to Britain. He became widely credited as an early planter who made commercial tea succeed in Ceylon, but tea experimentation on the island had begun earlier. The more careful account leaves room for those experiments and for the workers and knowledge that commercial success required. Coffee's decline made tea more attractive, and estates converted with remarkable speed. The existing plantation infrastructure helped. Roads, capital, labor arrangements, and access to ports could be redirected. Factories for tea required different equipment and rhythms, but the colonial framework was already present. Investors who had watched coffee plants fail could look across the same hills and imagine tea bushes covering the slopes. Recovery for owners meant another transformation of land and another demand for disciplined labor. Much of that labor came from South India under indentured arrangements. Workers traveled across the water and then inland toward the estates, often under difficult conditions. Families built lives in plantation districts while remaining subject to low pay, restricted opportunity, and political marginalization. Their work sustained both coffee and tea. When economic histories say that tea saved Ceylon's plantation industry, the phrase centers estates and revenue. For laboring families, the change meant continued work within a system they had not designed. On the slopes, plucking created a daily pattern. Workers moved between waist-high bushes with baskets held by straps or carried close to the body. Tender shoots were selected rather than stripped at random. The amount gathered mattered to wages and factory supply, while the condition of the leaf mattered to the tea. Mist gathered on clothing. Paths softened after rain. The hillside view could open toward distant ridges, yet attention remained close on the next shoot, the next basket, and the weight accumulated through the day. Inside Ceylon factories, leaves passed through withering, rolling, oxidation, drying, and sorting, producing teas that entered British and global blends. planters and brokers promoted the island's name as a mark of origin. Railway and port networks carried chests from the hills toward Colombo and onward by ship. The trade was modern in machinery and finance, but it still depended on precise manual work. Every auction lot began with people moving through rows of living plants. The histories of Assam and Ceylon, therefore, cannot be told as simple tales of British ingenuity. The plants were not blank material. Local and Chinese knowledge had histories of their own. Colonial governments supplied land rules and coercive authority. Companies supplied capital and market access. Botanists, managers, and technicians contributed expertise. More importantly, workers planted, pruned, plucked, carried, processed, packed, resisted, raised children, and built communities. The industry came from these combined forces, arranged within an unequal empire. Nor did British success replace China with a single news source. Global tea expanded through multiple regions, cultivars, styles, and markets. Chinese producers continued to cultivate and process tea. Indian and Ceylon teas developed distinct characters and commercial identities. Buyers blended leaves to create consistency across seasons. A breakfast tea in London might contain the work of several landscapes, brought together so that the consumer received a familiar cup even when harvests changed. Consistency required another layer of invisible judgment. Tasters examined dry leaf, infused leaf, color, aroma, and liquor, then assigned value within commercial systems. Brokers compared lots, blenders adjusted proportions, and packers sealed the result against moisture. These practices made plantation variation manageable for distant markets. They also reduced places and labor to grades and prices on a sheet. The more stable the cup seemed, the more successfully trade had hidden its seasonal differences. In Assam, the broad river valleys remained humid beneath heavy skies. In Ceylon, highland paths curved through slopes altered from forest to coffee and then tea. The two regions had different plants, histories, peoples, and climates, yet imperial commerce tied them to the same British appetite. Steamships shortened travel. Auctions organized exchange. Advertising made tea appear wholesome and near. The distance between worker and drinker widened even as transport became faster. The word garden softened the plantation. It suggested flowers, leisure, and careful beauty. A commercial tea estate could indeed be orderly and green, and workers could possess deep pride in skill and community. But the word should not conceal the systems of land acquisition, indenture, and labor control that built production at scale. Beauty and coercion occupied the same hillside. Historical honesty allows both to remain visible without forcing either one out of the frame. By evening, baskets returned from the fields and were emptied for weighing. Fresh leaves formed soft green heaps before they spread across the withering surface. Names might be written in a book, totals entered, and the day's work converted into figures. Beyond the factory veranda, mist began to settle among the rows. The people who had gathered the leaves washed their hands, tended meals, spoke with family, and prepared for another day shaped by the estate. The most truthful closing image is not a planter's portrait or a company crest. It is a pair of practiced hands choosing a tender shoot, then another pair lifting a basket, and many more hands spreading leaves where warm air can move through them. The motion slow as evening enters the garden. Mist rests on the bushes, baskets stand quietly by the path, and the green leaves breathe out their moisture in the dark. In the later 19th century, a tea chest leaving Shanghai could begin its westward journey beneath a forest of masts. Clippers were built for speed, with long hulls, broad spreads of canvas, and crews trained to answer changes in wind with practiced hands. Merchants valued the early arrival of the new season's tea, and newspapers turned passages into races. On the quay, however, the work began more slowly. Chests were counted, inspected, lifted, and fitted into the hold until a cargo of leaves became part of the ship's weight and balance. The Cutty Sark was launched in 1869, near the end of the brief age when tea clippers held their special advantage. On her maiden voyage in 1870, she sailed to Shanghai and carried 1,305,812 pounds of tea back toward London. The number suggests scale, yet the cargo consisted of countless leaves that had already passed through farms, workshops, warehouses, and packing rooms. Each chest was a small, dark chamber, lined to protect its contents from damp and ocean air, then stacked among timbers that creaked for months at sea. Life aboard a clipper followed wind and maintenance rather than the calm schedule of a tea table. Sails had to be raised, shortened, repaired, and shifted. Salt gathered on rope and rail. The ship leaned under canvas while water moved past the hull in a continuous rush. Speed brought commercial prestige, but it also depended on weather that no owner could command. A season of favorable winds might create a celebrated passage, while delay could reduce the value attached to arriving before rival cargoes. The opening of the Suez Canal in the same year that Cutty Sark was launched helped change the balance. Steamships could use the canal and follow a shorter route between Asian ports and Europe, while sailing ships were less suited to the narrow waterway and its dependence on controlled movement. Steam offered schedules less bound to wind. The clipper did not vanish in an instant, but its special place in the tea trade faded. Cutty Sark herself moved to other cargoes as the transport system changed around her. The romance of sail yielded to a quieter industrial regularity. Coal bunkers, engines, port timetables, bills of lading, insurance, rail connections, and warehouses joined the journey. Tea could travel in larger, more predictable flows. The voyage was still long, but the uncertainty narrowed. A buyer in London no longer needed to imagine every chest as part of a race around the Cape. The leaf entered a network designed to make distance routine. Modern tea still begins before any ship, train, truck, packet, or kettle. It begins with a living plant that responds to soil, altitude, rain, temperature, shade, pruning, insects, and human care. Camellia sinensis includes varieties and cultivars selected for different environments and qualities. The familiar families of tea can arise from this species, but they do not become different drinks through the plant name alone. Place and processing guide the leaf toward color, aroma, texture, and the way it will open in hot water. In Chinese traditions recognized for their breadth and continuity, 6 broad categories are named as green, yellow, dark, white, oolong, and black tea. These categories contain many local methods and products, and other regions may organize tea in their own ways. The list is best held as a map rather than a set of rigid boxes. Within it, varieties, cultivars, seasons, elevations, leaf grades, and craftsmanship create further differences. A small change in timing can move the finished cup in another direction. The passage from shoot to dry tea begins with selection. On many farms, pluckers look for tender growth, often a bud and young leaves suited to the desired product. This does not mean every tea follows one picking standard. Coarser leaves may be appropriate for some styles, and mechanized harvesting may gather a broader section of growth. The central fact is attention. Someone or some machine separates a portion of living plant from the bush, and from that moment the leaf begins to change. Fresh leaves hold water and remain biologically active. They bruise, warm, wilt, and react with the air. Processing organizes these changes rather than merely drying the plant. In a factory or workshop, baskets arrive according to the rhythm of harvest. The leaves may be spread thinly, turned, carried, and watched. Their scent shifts from cut greenery toward flowers, fruit, wood, malt, or other notes that workers learn to recognize through repetition. Time is measured by clock and by hand. Withering is used in many tea styles, though not in identical ways or to an identical degree. Leaves rest on mats, racks, bamboo trays, or long troughs while moisture leaves them. Air may move naturally through a room or be guided by fans. A thick leaf and a fine leaf respond differently. Humid weather slows the process. Dry air quickens it. Workers touch and bend the leaf, listening through texture for the moment when it is ready for what comes next. For some green teas, heat is applied early to limit oxidation. A pan, heated drum, steaming apparatus, or another method may be used according to regional practice. The goal is not one universal flavor, but controlled transformation. The leaf softens, loses its raw edge, and becomes ready for shaping. Hands or machines may roll it into twists, curls, needles, pellets, or flatter forms. Heat and motion alternate until the tea can be dried and stored. White tea generally receives comparatively restrained handling, yet even this simple description contains many choices. Harvest standard, withering conditions, duration, drying, and local tradition matter. The pale buds and leaves may rest while air does much of the work. Their appearance seems quiet because the process avoids heavy shaping, but quiet does not mean unattended. The producer watches weather and moisture, knowing that a gentle method can still go wrong when conditions drift. Oolong teas occupy a broad field of partial oxidation and skilled manipulation. Leaves may be withered, shaken, or tumbled to bruise their edges, rested, heated, rolled, and dried through sequences repeated according to style. The edges and surfaces react differently as cells are disturbed. Fragrance develops through carefully managed intervals. One oolong can be light and floral, another dark and roasted, and neither result comes from a separate species labeled for that flavor. It comes from cultivar, place, and a long conversation between leaf, air, heat, and human judgment. Black tea is chiefly described through oxidation. After withering, leaves are rolled or otherwise disrupted so enzymes and compounds meet oxygen more fully. Green surfaces darken toward copper and brown, and aromas deepen. Producers stop the process with drying when the desired character has formed. The older habit of calling this transformation fermentation can blur an important distinction. Oxidation here is not the same as the microbial activity involved in suitable dark or post-fermented teas. Dark tea may undergo microbial fermentation during later processing or aging, depending on its tradition. Moisture, compression, warmth, storage, and communities of microorganisms can contribute to change. Such teas connect the present factory to the compressed cakes and bricks that traveled mountain routes in earlier chapters. Yet their methods also vary, and no single sequence can stand for every dark tea. The careful language leaves space for the producers who understand each local process in more detail than a broad history can hold. Yellow tea is another category with particular methods that may include a controlled stage in which heated leaves are wrapped or covered, allowing a gentle transformation before final drying. Even within the 6-category map, boundaries can be discussed differently by specialists and regions. The important point for a quiet journey is that tea diversity does not require 6 unrelated plants. A shared botanical foundation can support many results when people guide moisture, oxidation, microbial activity, shape, heat, and time along different paths. After the principal transformation, tea must be dried enough to keep. Warm air carries away moisture, and the leaves become lighter, crisper, and stable for packing. Sorting then separates pieces by size and form. These grades do not translate perfectly into flavor or moral rank. They help factories and buyers describe material for sale and blending. Whole leaves, broken leaves, smaller particles, and dust may enter different products, each suited to a particular brewing method or market. Blending can create consistency from changing harvests. A skilled blender compares teas from different estates, elevations, regions, or seasons, then combines them so a familiar product tastes similar over time. The work is partly sensory and partly commercial. Color, strength, aroma, cost, and availability each matter. The label may remain unchanged while the proportions within it shift. This quiet adjustment is one reason a breakfast cup can feel dependable even though agriculture never repeats a year exactly. Packing protects the dry leaf from moisture, strong odors, light, and careless handling. Tea once traveled mainly in chests, and many forms of bulk packing remain important even as retail packets, tins, sachets, and bags have multiplied. No single invention story is needed to explain this variety. Packaging changed through patents, machines, trade habits, convenience, and consumer preference. The leaf simply moved into smaller and more standardized portions as retailers sought new ways to sell it. The industrial route continues through auction rooms, direct contracts, warehouses, ports, container terminals, rail yards, distribution centers, and shop shelves. Some teas travel as named single origins. Others disappear into blends assembled far from the field. A shipment may wait under fluorescent lights, scanned into a system no sailor on a clipper could have imagined. Yet it still needs dryness, careful storage, and protection from the surrounding air, much as the lined chest did in 1870. Large estates remain important, but much of modern tea production comes from small farms. In reporting from 2025 and 2026, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that smallholders produced more than 60% of the world's tea, and that the sector supported more than 13 million people, including farmers and their families. These are dated estimates rather than permanent numbers. They offer a sense of scale while reminding us that the tea landscape extends far beyond famous plantations. A smallholder may manage a modest plot, harvest leaf with family labor or hired workers, and sell fresh material to a nearby factory. Because green leaf cannot wait indefinitely, distance and timing shape bargaining power. Access to roads, transport, market information, credit, extension services, and reliable buyers can determine whether careful cultivation earns a stable return. The finished packet may travel across the world, while the farmer at the beginning of the chain receives a price influenced by systems largely beyond the farm boundary. Tea also grows within relatively narrow ecological conditions. Temperature, rainfall, soil, altitude, and seasonal rhythms affect both survival and quality. Extreme weather can damage bushes, interrupt plucking, wash out roads, or alter the timing on which factories depend. A long dry period may reduce growth, while intense rain can bring erosion and disease pressure. Climate risk therefore enters the cup through harvest volume, flavor, cost, and the stability of livelihoods. The challenge is not simply to keep leaves available to consumers. It is to sustain the people and landscapes that make the drink possible. Farmers and workers face questions of farm gate price, wages, land, credit, market access, quality standards, and transparency across a chain with many intermediaries. Efforts toward resilience may include soil care, shade management, water protection, diversified income, improved weather information, better planting material, and fairer commercial arrangements. None offers a single answer for every region. Extension services can translate research into choices suited to a particular district, while access to credit can determine whether a farmer is able to renew bushes, improve drainage, or survive a poor season. Market access decides how quickly leaf reaches a buyer and how many buyers can compete for it. These practical details are quiet, but they shape whether resilience remains a promise or becomes part of daily work. Traceability has become another form of attention. Buyers may seek to know the garden, cooperative, factory, or district behind a tea, while certification systems attempt to record environmental and labor practices. Such systems can help, but labels do not remove every imbalance. Verification costs, buyer power, and the ability of small farms to meet changing requirements matter. A transparent chain is not created merely by printing a place name on a packet. It requires relationships that carry information and value back toward the people at the beginning. At origin, producers also taste the work as it develops. Small measured samples are infused, their color and aroma compared, and the opened leaves examined after the water is poured away. This repeated tasting is not a decorative pause. It helps a factory or workshop understand the day's material, adjust later batches, separate qualities, and prepare tea for buyers. The cup used for judgment links cultivation to commerce long before the retail drinker fills a kettle. Then the samples cool, their surfaces becoming still, while notes are written and the next set of leaves waits nearby. At the same time, tea remains a social practice rather than a supply chain alone. People boil it strongly with milk and spices, whisk powder into water, steep loose leaves through several infusions, brew a pot for many cups, or place a convenient portion into a mug. Some drink it in formal gatherings, others beside a desk or on a doorstep. These practices do not collapse into one correct method. They show how a traded leaf is continually made local through water, vessels, timing, hospitality, and memory. Your own kettle stands near the end of this long sequence. Water enters it through a pipe and tap, or from a container carried to the room. Heat comes from electricity, gas, flame, or another source. The water rises in temperature, currents moving inside until sound begins. A packet or tin is opened. Dry leaves wait in a pot, cup, basket, or strainer, holding the shape given to them by distant hands. When hot water meets the tea, the dry form relaxes. Rolled leaves loosen. Flat leaves lift and settle. Small particles release color quickly, while larger pieces may open more slowly. Aroma moves upward with steam, and the room receives traces of the field and the processing floor. Brewing is another transformation, brief compared with cultivation and transport, yet decisive for the cup. Temperature, time, water, proportion, and vessel each make a difference. The old clipper race has now become a quiet pause beside a modern appliance. Steamships, canals, railways, trucks, and containers have shortened the apparent distance, though the actual chain remains long. Behind the small action of pouring stand seasons of growth, minutes of plucking, hours of withering, careful heat, contracts, roads, ports, warehouses, and shelves. Convenience does not make these stages unreal. It simply folds them into an object small enough to hold in one hand. The cup also carries the rooms and roads through which our history has passed. There is the uncertain botanical landscape before legend hardened into a date, and the Tang brazier beside cake tea and a stone for grinding. There are song bowls dark enough to show pale foam, Ming leaves opening in a pot, and a quiet Kyoto room where host and guests attend to bamboo, clay, water, and charcoal. Each setting changed what tea meant without exhausting its possibilities. Beyond that room lie the forest gardens of Jingmai and the gathering places of Pu'er, then many mountain roads rather than one simple highway. Compressed leaves rest beside rope and pack animals. On the Tibetan plateau, a kettle warms a local preparation shaped by region and household. The wind moves above the path, and the brick of tea reminds us that transport once required a form sturdy enough to be stacked, divided, exchanged, and carried through cold air. Then come the locked caddy and rain-dark window of Britain, the company warehouse, the customs book, the smuggler's hidden load, and the spoonful of sugar bound to plantation slavery in the West Indies. The Boston Harbor receives its chests, and the opium trade reveals the cost of balancing silver accounts. The cup grows common, while its imperial structure spreads farther from view. Familiarity settles over the object like steam, softening its outline but not changing its past. The road continues into Assam, where Singpho knowledge and Manaram Dutta Barua belong near the beginning of any honest colonial account. It passes the tea committee, experimental plots, Chinese expertise carried under company direction, and Wardian cases full of vulnerable plants. It moves through indenture, restricted movement, low wages, resistance, and the disciplined labor of plantation production. In Ceylon, coffee rust alters the hills, tea expands, and South Indian workers sustain the new industry with their days. Now the circle returns to a living shoot, pale at the tip of a bush. A hand selects it in morning light, and the leaf begins a final journey through air, pressure, warmth, sorting, packing, travel, and water. The hand may belong to a worker on a large estate, or to a farmer tending a small plot. The kettle in your room is linked to that hand, not by romance, but by a chain of material work. The steam above your cup is the same gentle image with which we began, though it now carries more places within it. A young leaf opens, the water grows still, and distant paths settle into the quiet of the room. Let the kettle cool without hurry, while the last thread of steam becomes thin and disappears, and let the fields, ships, bowls, roads, warehouses, gardens, and working hands rest together in the dark. Thank you for spending the night in history with me. I'm the Yawning Historian.